You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside of his skin and walk around in it. Words spoken by one of the wisest characters written in literature, Atticus Finch. Atticus Finch was the father of Jem and Scout Finch. Together they lived in Macomb County, Sweet Home, Alabama. The story follows the life of these children and their father. The book has 2 divisions and 31 chapters. It's quite an interesting story that looks at themes of childhood innocence, good versus evil, lying, racism, and so much more. However, today it is not my intent to analyze the characters, nor the plot, nor the theme. I will be analyzing the point of view. My name is Dorrethea Grant, and in this presentation, as I previously said, I'll be looking at the point of view in the story To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Firstly, I'm going to look at an overview of the points of view in part 1. As I said, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee is divided into 2 divisions, part 1 and part 2. So in part 1, the point of view is first person central point of view. According to Masterclass 2021, in first person central point of view, the narrator is also the protagonist at the heart of the plot. This is most definitely the case for To Kill a Mockingbird, as we know that Scout is both the protagonist and the narrator of the story. But before we get deep into it and analyzing it, I just want to provide a few examples of where we see the first person point of view being used. Now, here we have a table showing examples and evidences of the first person point of view. Firstly, until I feared I would lose it, I never loved to read. That's on page 24. At this point, I remember Scout, she was talking about her experience learning how to read, right? And she was saying that her father would run his finger across the pages of the newspaper. This statement is evidence of first person point of view. Firstly, because of the use of pronoun. That's one of the biggest telltale signs of what point of view it is in. So because she uses the pronoun I, we know that it's first person narrative. Another reason is because it talks about the narrator's personal emotions. She's not talking about the emotions or the deep thoughts, the intimate thoughts of the other characters. No, she's talking about how she feels. She feared she would lose it. I feared I would lose it. So that's first person. Another example is, I told Atticus I didn't feel very well and didn't think I'd go to school anymore if it was alright with him. Now I remember in the presentation about point of view, Brandel was talking about point of view potholes. Oh, not because we see the pronoun him, which usually signifies third person. Not because we see that means it really is third person. You have to look at it some more and be sure. We still see the use of the pronoun I. I told Atticus. Furthermore, the narrator, Scout, she's talking about her personal emotions and her personal feelings. I didn't feel very well. Another example says, sometimes I did not understand him, but my periods of bewilderment were short-lived. The use of pronoun once again. I did not understand him. This is something that signifies first person point of view. The expression of the narrator's personal thoughts. So the narrator, her thoughts are being told throughout the story. It says, I did not understand him. She was bewildered, but her bewilderments were short-lived. So we know this is first person point of view because mainly because of the use of pronoun I, the fact that we're seeing the events of the story happening through her eyes, the fact that we are hearing the thoughts of the narrator, we're hearing about her personal feelings. So we know that this is first person central point of view. Now I'll move along to the effectiveness of this point of view. Why did Harper Lee choose first person point of view? All of that, we're going to look at it, and I'm going to be looking at it in 3 phases. As it relates to the narrator, how is that point of view effective? As it relates to the coming of age of the narrator, and as it relates to the themes portrayed in the story. Now let's talk about the narrator. The narrator of To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee is Jean Louise Finch. She acts as both the narrator and the protagonist of the novel. Scout is the daughter in a single-parent family. As it says on page 12, Jem was a product of their first marriage. 4 years later, I was born, and 2 years later, our mother died. So we know that this family is a single-parent family because, unfortunately, the mother had died. The thing or the issue with child narrators now, because many readers do not appreciate child narrators. We know that Scout at the beginning of the story is 6 years old. It says on page 12, when I was almost 6 and Jem was nearly 10, or summertime boundaries, and it continued to list them, but that part of it is not relevant, right? So we know that Scout is 6 years old. She's a child. The story is told in first person through a child's point of view. Because of her young age, the question will usually become, is she a reliable narrator? Children are not considered to be reliable narrators because of their tendency to misinterpret things. For example, according to SparkNotes, in some ways, because she's so young, Scout is an unreliable narrator. Her innocence causes her to misunderstand things, and her childhood perspective interferes with her description of other characters. This ultimately influences how readers view other characters. And the example that they give is she considers her father feeble because he's nearly 50. To a child, 50 seems ancient, but to other adults, it may be considered middle-aged. So we see right there that her description of other people is interfered with because of her innocence. She's calling her father feeble, and as we continue to read the story and learn more about Atticus, we realize Atticus is not feeble at all. He's a very strong character, but she describes him as feeble simply because he's almost 50. Another example of how her childhood perspective shapes the opinions of readers as it relates to character is with Boo Radley. I believe that every neighborhood has at least one home that as children we believe it's haunted because the persons that live there, we barely see them. They're so strange. We'd make stories about the persons living there. And for Jem Dillon Scout, this person was Boo Radley. He was awfully strange and they would never see him. Scout describes Boo as 6.5 feet tall. He dined on raw squirrels and any cats he could catch. That's why his hands were blood-stained. If you ate an animal raw, you could never wash the blood off. There was a long jagged scar that ran across his face. What teeth he had were yellow and rotten. His eyes popped and he drooled most of the time. That was found on page 19. With a description as detailed as this, we can say that Scout's imaginative mind definitely interferes with her description of people, and we can extend it to say events. But she is a very observant narrator. We have to appreciate that with child narrators, they are often very observant because children are always watching. And it's the same with Scout. She's observant. She noticed the details on Boo Radley's person, on his body. Hietanan, I can't pronounce his name, but Andrew Hietanan, 2013, he agrees, saying that the reader gets a good description of each character because Scout is observant of every person that she comes across. For example, Scout's love for Jem, Capernia, and Atticus make both of these characters very appealing appealing to us. Scout's frustration with Aunt Alexandra and her attitudes makes Alexandra a less appealing as person to us. So yes, we see the influence that the child narrator can have on readers and shaping the point of view or your own opinion as a reader of a character. Now, despite Scout's innocence, she's very observant, and that makes her reliable. According to SparkNotes, Scout's innocence makes her more trustworthy as a narrator than an adult might be, in that she lacks the sophistication to shape her story or withhold information for her own benefit. In other words, the fact that Scout is young and innocent, and we know how children are in the sense that they call things as they see them. They don't hold back anything, although we wish they would. But they call things as they see them, and that's the exact same thing with Scout. She just says it as she sees it, and yes, because she's young and innocent and not as exposed as we are as adults, it might interfere with how she describes things and views things. Her imagination may often take over, but she's still trustworthy because she doesn't shape or try to manipulate readers into thinking one way or another. And this allows readers to trust her more. This allows readers to connect with her even more and feel her emotions even more. First person point of view is very effective in this story. We're going to be talking about Bildungsroman. According to Masterclass 2021, a Bildungsroman is a literary term describing a formative novel about a protagonist's psychological and moral growth from their youth into adulthood. Bildungsroman novels are generally written in the first person. This is the case with To Kill a Mockingbird. The story begins when Scout is 6 and ends when she's 8. However, as the novel progresses, there are subtle hints that causes the point of view of the story to expand. Follow me now. From simply being a first-person central point of view to being a story told from the first-person point of view of Scout as an adult who narrates in retrospect during the time of the narrative. Perhaps you're wondering, how do we know that the narrator is adult Scout? Well, according to eNotes, they explain it saying that a clue that the narrator is an adult can be found in her sentence describing the debate she and Jem have concerning the story started long before that. The adverb long indicates that the events of the story took place many years ago. So this is a hint to us that perhaps the Scout that is narrating is a little older. But what it is that adult Scout is narrating in retrospect. So it is still through the eyes of child Scout. The interesting mix of adult and child in Scout as narrator contributes greatly to the narrative as a Bildungsroman. Andrew Hietanen says that the first person point of view affects the novel so much because it is told through the mind of a child. Although it is told by a child, we see how Scout matures over the course of the novel, especially during the trial. This is why we call it a Bildungsroman or a coming-of-age novel. Through her point of view, we can realize, oh wow, Scout is aging. Beautiful. And it's very effective because of this. Now we know of the different themes that Harper Lee wanted to bring out in this story. One of them is racism. Hietanen again, he says in 2013, he said, first person point of view shows the reader Scout's reactions and thoughts towards racism and harsh comments about her father throughout the town during the trial. She often gets in fights with the boys at her school because of what they say about Atticus. When the trial starts, the reader sees how Scout matures and realizes how the treatment of Tom and the rest of the African Americans is wrong, but she also does not fully understand it. She is a child narrator after all. This points to other themes that Harper Lee intended to bring out, such as good versus evil. The novel was actually released in the height of the civil rights movement, and it puts a personal spin on tense racial issues in the South by placing a relatable story into the hands of every American student. Shapiro 2016. And I'd like to add to that, Harper Lee essentially placed the story into the hands of a child because it's told using the voice of a child. So we're going to be discussing a little more part 2 of the book. But first, I just want to say that Harper Lee desired to display moral values and the difference of rights versus wrong, especially through the theme of racism. And that was prevalent, as we said before, during the civil rights movement in the 1960s, which is when the book was written. Harper Lee does this effectively by making Scout the protagonist and narrator, an innocent girl describing her observations. I just really appreciate it when narrators decide to use the voices of children to talk about serious issues like racism and good versus evil. And it's in the process it brings out to adults or adult readers the whole world surrounding children and childhood innocence and the reality of it, how little children really understand about the adult world. I really love stories like this one and Emma that just uses the voice of children to talk about serious issues. We're going to now look at part 1, an overview of the point of view in part 2. In part 2. In the second section of To Kill a Mockingbird, there's a mixture of first-person central and first-person peripheral perspective. In the first-person peripheral perspective, the narrator is another character in the story, one who witnesses the main character's story and conveys it to the reader. The peripheral narrator may be a part of the action, but he's not the focus. For instance, during the trial, Atticus becomes the protagonist of the story, and Scout is literally just an audience in the court, relaying the information exactly as she sees it. Her descriptions become strictly visual, and the story is mostly carried out through dialogue at these points in the story. For instance, on page 175, the story says, as Mr. Tate turned and looked at Tom Robinson as if to say, this was something they had not bargained for. Her arms were bruised and she showed me her neck. There were definite finger marks on her gullet. All around her throat, at the back of her neck? I'd say they were all around, Mr. Finch. You would? Yes, sir. She had a small throat. Anybody could have reached around it with. Just answer the question, yes or no, please, Sheriff, said Atticus dryly, and Mr. Tate fell silent. Atticus sat down and nodded to the circuit solicitor, who shook his head at the judge, who nodded to Mr. Tate, who rose stiffly and stepped down from the witness stand. That's page 175. So as we see, the story at this point is mostly dialogue and just stating straight facts and observations of the actions of the characters. It would almost seem as if it was third person perspective at this time. However, we know that Scout remains the narrator, so it is actually first person peripheral point of view. I believe that Harper Lee was intentional about switching to this point of view to connote the seriousness of the issue of the trial that was at hand. I remember the first time that I read the story, and whenever the children stepped into the courthouse, Jem and Scout, when they stepped into the courthouse and they sneaked up to the area where the colored folks would sit, it would feel as if it's just a different story after that, because the point of view just completely switched. I would forget about the characters Scout and Jem and Dale, and it was just Atticus who became the protagonist of the story. And I remember that sometimes when the trial ended and the description of those scenes ended, I felt like I was dramatically pulled back into reality by the simple use of the pronoun I. For example, on page 177, Mr. Gilmer's back stiffened a little and I felt sorry for him. This would remind me that, oh yeah, Scout and Jem and all those other characters are in the story. It's not just the trial with Atticus and Mr. Robinson and Mr. Tate. Harper Lee did an excellent job to me with the transitions in this story from first person central to peripheral, and the seriousness of racism was definitely captivated by that simple switch in the point of view of the story. Now, just to recap, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee was told from the first person central point of view. The narrator was a child narrator, however, it was adult Scout who narrated in retrospect during the time of her childhood, which was the time of the narrative, the Great Depression. Right? We also discussed part 2 of the story that focused a lot more on the trial, Atticus's trial, and Tom Robinson and Tate, and the theme of racism came out much more there. So we discussed the switch of the point of view between first person central and first person peripheral, which was effective in discussing the themes of racism, good versus evil, and the many other themes that came out in part 2. And just to add, although I'm concluding, I think that if Harper Lee had not switched to the peripheral point of view for first person in part 2, then persons would have probably assumed that she was making fun or making light of the issue of racism. And remember that it was in the civil movement's time. So, if she kept it as a first person central point of view, we'd be hearing a lot more of Scout's thoughts and opinions, and that would seem as if she's making light of the issue. So I think it was a smart move. I believe it was a smart move for Harper to have switched to the peripheral point of view. As I close, it's quite ironic to me that Atticus Finch says to his daughter, the quote that we started with, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside of his skin and walk around in it." To me, it seems as if Harper Lee was telling us exactly why she chose to use the first person narrative. We walked around in Scout's skin and saw the world through her eyes, understood so much more about Macomb County, the characters in the story like Calpurnia, Dale and Atticus and Jem, and the plot really came together nicely because of the point of view that Harper Lee decided to use. So thank you so much to Harper Lee. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good afternoon.